The earth didn't just shake, it screamed. Corporal Heinrich Brandt felt the tremor before he heard the sound. A deep, subterranean roar that traveled through the reinforced concrete beneath his boots like the heartbeat of some ancient, awakening god. He was 3 levels down in Fortress Königstein, buried in the Eifel Mountains where the morning light never reached, where the air tasted of dampness and machine oil and the sweat of 200 men who hadn't seen the sky in 6 days. The first shell hit at 06:47 hours on March 19, 1945. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Heinrich had been writing a letter to his sister Greta, telling her about the apple tree in their childhood yard, the one that bloomed white every April no matter how harsh the winter had been. His pencil was moving across the page. Do you remember how Father said that tree was our promise that spring always returns? When the world turned inside out. The light bulb above his head exploded in a shower of glass. The metal cup on his desk danced sideways and fell. Somewhere in the tunnels beyond, men were shouting, but their voices sounded distant, muffled, as if Heinrich had cotton stuffed in his ears. The second shell arrived 7 seconds later. This one was closer. The walls groaned, actually groaned, like a living thing in pain. Dust rained from the ceiling in thick curtains. Heinrich grabbed the edge of his desk as the floor bucked beneath him, and the letter to Greta, half finished, ink still wet, slid off and disappeared into the darkness gathering at his feet. He lunged for it, fingers grasping at nothing. And that's when he saw Sergeant Müller in the doorway. Müller was 53 years old, a veteran of the Great War who walked with a limp from Verdun and kept a photograph of his dead wife in his breast pocket. His face was gray as limestone. "They brought up the big guns," he said, and his voice had the hollow quality of a man speaking from the bottom of a well. "The Americans, they brought up something new." Heinrich had served under Müller for 18 months. He'd never heard fear in the sergeant's voice before. They climbed to the observation post together, navigating corridors that twisted like intestines through the mountain's belly. Other soldiers pressed against the walls as they passed, young men mostly, boys really, with faces that still held the softness of adolescence beneath the grime. Private Vogel, who collected butterflies in a notebook. Lieutenant Hartmann, who played violin before the war. Corporal Schmidt, who'd promised his pregnant wife he'd be home by Christmas 3 Christmases ago. The observation post was a concrete blister jutting from the fortress's eastern face, designed to survey the valley below and the road that snaked through it toward the Rhine. The viewing slit was narrow, 8 inches wide, reinforced with steel. But through it, Heinrich could see the world being remade. The valley was on fire. Not the clean fire of burning wood or coal, but something more fundamental, more terrible. The American artillery position was 3 miles distant, positioned on the reverse slope of Hill 447. And from this range, Heinrich could see the guns themselves, massive, incomprehensible things, barrel lengths that seemed to stretch halfway to heaven, mounted on tracked vehicles that dwarfed the tanks he'd seen throughout the war. Smoke bloomed around them in gray-white flowers as they fired, and even at this distance, even through the thick fortress walls, he could hear them. A sound like the tearing of the world's fabric, like God clearing his throat before pronouncing judgment. 280 millimeters, Müller said quietly beside him. He was smoking a cigarette, even though it was forbidden in the observation post, even though Müller himself had written the regulation. His hands shook as he brought it to his lips. "I heard about them. Didn't believe the reports, you know. Trying to scare us, break morale." Another shell screamed overhead. Heinrich could actually see it, a dark streak against the pale morning sky, spinning as it flew, and part of his mind marveled at that, at being able to track something moving so impossibly fast. It struck the fortress's north bastion, and this time the explosion was close enough that Heinrich felt it in his chest cavity, felt his heart stutter and skip. The bastion was 100 yards away. The bastion was solid concrete, reinforced steel, 6 feet thick at its narrowest point. Designed by German engineers who'd studied the fortresses of Verdun and the Maginot Line and sworn they'd build something better, something impregnable. The bastion cracked like an eggshell. Heinrich watched through the viewing slit as a fissure opened in the concrete, a black lightning bolt that spread from impact point to foundation in less than a second. Chunks of reinforced wall the size of automobiles tumbled down the mountainside. Inside that bastion were ammunition stores, medical supplies, fresh water reserves. Inside were men.
"We need to evacuate," Heinrich heard himself say. His voice sounded strange, detached, as if someone else was speaking with his mouth. "Sir, we need to get everyone out." Müller took a long drag on his cigarette, exhaled slowly. "Evacuate where, Corporal? You see any safe ground out there?" Heinrich looked. The valley stretched 15 miles from the fortress to the American lines, and in those 15 miles there was nowhere to hide. The forests had been stripped by winter and previous bombardments. The villages were rubble. The roads were cratered moonscapes. And beyond it all, beyond the immediate hell of the present moment, Heinrich could see more American units moving up. Trucks, tanks, infantry formations that looked like ants from this distance, swarming forward in a tide that had no end. Another shell, another crack in the fortress walls. This one struck the western gun emplacement, where Fortress Königstein's own artillery pieces sat useless now, outranged by miles, turned into expensive sculptures by the American superiority in firepower. Heinrich had helped crew one of those guns during the autumn. He remembered the weight of the shells, the smell of cordite, the brief feeling of power that came from sending destruction toward an enemy you couldn't see. That feeling seemed childish now. A game played by fools who didn't understand the true scope of war. "My grandfather helped build this fortress," Müller said suddenly. He was still staring out the viewing slit, cigarette burning down to nothing between his fingers. "Did I ever tell you that? 1936, right after they started the rearmament. He was a mason, laid concrete for 3 years. Used to tell me stories about it when I was little, how thick the walls were, how deep the foundations went. Said it could withstand anything. Said it was the future." Heinrich didn't know what to say. The fortress shook again. Somewhere below, someone was screaming. "The Americans call them atomic cannons because they're designed to fire nuclear shells. Can you imagine? We're being destroyed by guns built to end the world." He laughed then, a short, bitter sound. "And they're not even using the nuclear ammunition. They don't need to. Conventional explosives work just fine." The observation post had a telephone, a direct line to the command bunker where Colonel Steiner coordinated the fortress's defense. Müller picked up the receiver, listened for a moment, then set it back down gently. "Line's dead. We're on our own." They stayed in the observation post for 20 minutes more, watching the systematic destruction of everything they'd been told was indestructible. The Americans weren't rushing. They fired at measured intervals, one shell every 30 to 40 seconds, each one precisely targeted, each one achieving what it was designed to achieve. The North Bastion collapsed entirely at 0709 hours, tons of concrete and steel sliding down the mountainside in a gray avalanche. The radio tower fell at 0715 hours, its antenna mast bending slowly, almost gracefully, before crashing across the fortress's main courtyard. At 0721 hours, a shell penetrated the eastern magazine, and the resulting secondary explosion was powerful enough that Heinrich thought for a moment the mountain itself might split open. But it was the silence between the shells that truly terrified him. In those 30-second intervals, in those brief pauses between one apocalypse and the next, Heinrich could hear everything with terrible clarity. The groaning of stressed concrete, the hiss of ruptured water pipes, men calling for medics, men calling for their mothers, men calling for God. And underneath it all, a sound he'd never heard before, a kind of creaking, settling noise, like the fortress was a great ship taking on water, listing slowly toward its final rest. Private Vogel appeared in the observation post doorway. His face was bleeding from a dozen small cuts, and his uniform was white with concrete dust. "Sergeant," he gasped, "the colonel wants all officers and senior NCOs in the deep bunker. He's calling a council." "A council," Müller repeated, flatly. "To discuss what? Our surrender terms?" Vogel flinched. The word surrender was still taboo, even now, even with the fortress dying around them. "He didn't say, sir. He just said to come, and to bring the roster books." The roster books. The careful ledgers where they recorded every man's name, rank, hometown, next of kin. Heinrich had helped maintain them, had written dozens of entries in his neat handwriting. Killed in action, died of wounds, missing, presumed dead. He'd thought of them as administrative necessities, bureaucratic requirements of military life. Only now did he understand their true purpose. They were the last witness, the final proof that these men had existed at all. They descended into darkness, deeper than before, past the level where Heinrich had been writing his letter, past the storage chambers and sleeping quarters and command posts, down to the deepest part of Fortress Königstein, where the rock was oldest and thickest, and where, theoretically, a man might survive even if the mountain fell on his head. The deep bunker was a natural cavern that had been expanded and reinforced, its walls lined with concrete, but retaining the rough organic shape of the original cave. It smelled of dampness and ancient stone and the sweat of frightened men. 50 officers and NCOs were gathered when Heinrich and Müller arrived. They stood in loose groups, speaking in low voices, their faces illuminated by electric lanterns that cast jumping shadows on the walls. Colonel Steiner stood at the cavern's center, ramstrod straight despite his 62 years, his uniform still perfectly pressed even though the world was ending over his head. The table before him lay a map of the fortress and the surrounding valley, covered with marks and notations in red pencil, that now seemed hopelessly optimistic. The colonel waited until everyone was present, then spoke without preamble. "Gentlemen, Fortress Königstein can no longer fulfill its defensive function. The American 280mm guns have achieved what 3 months of conventional bombardment could not. They have broken our walls. Our casualties..."
Approaching 40%. We have lost all external communications. We have lost our ability to provide covering fire for the units to our west. In short, we have failed. The word hung in the air like smoke. Failed. However, Steiner continued, and his voice remained steady, remained professional, remained everything a Prussian officer's voice should be. We retain the ability to make one final choice. We can surrender immediately and save the lives of the men still under our command. Or we can continue fighting from the tunnels and lower levels, making the Americans pay for every meter in blood and time, knowing that such resistance is ultimately futile but might buy hours or days for our comrades retreating toward the Rhine. Another shell struck. Even here, 400 feet underground, they felt it, a shudder that ran through the rock like a ripple through water. Dust sifted down from the ceiling. No one spoke. "I will not order you to die," Steiner said quietly. "Not anymore. Not for this. Those who wish to continue the fight may do so. Those who wish to lay down arms will not be judged. The choice is yours, and yours alone." Heinrich found himself thinking about the letter to Greta, lost in the darkness of his quarters somewhere above. He'd written about the apple tree, about the promise of spring, about believing that good things could endure.
He wondered if she would ever know what happened to him. He wondered if it mattered. Sergeant Müller was the first to speak. "Sir, if I may ask, have you received any communication from higher command? Any orders regarding—" He stopped, unable or unwilling to finish the sentence. "The last communication I received was 3 days ago. It instructed us to hold at all costs, to die with honor, to remember our duty to the fatherland." He paused. "I believe those orders no longer reflect the reality of our situation." Someone, Heinrich couldn't see who, laughed quietly in the darkness. It was a sound without humor, without hope. "We have 2 hours," Steiner concluded. "I will spend that time attempting to contact the American command to arrange surrender terms. Use that time as you see fit. Pray, rest, write letters if you can. Make your peace." He looked around at all of them, his face carved from stone, his eyes infinitely tired. "Gentlemen, it has been my honor to serve with you. Whatever comes next, remember that we did our duty as we understood it. No man can do more." The council dissolved into small groups. Heinrich and Müller walked back through the tunnels without speaking, navigating by memory now as the electric lights had begun to fail. They passed other soldiers moving through the darkness, ghosts in gray uniforms, faces hollow and blank, all of them waiting for whatever came next. Heinrich tried to return to his quarters to search for the letter, but the corridor was blocked by fallen concrete. He stood before the impassable barrier for a long moment, then turned away. The letter was gone. Perhaps that was appropriate. Perhaps some things weren't meant to survive. In the observation post, the bombardment continued. Through the viewing slit, Heinrich watched the sun rise fully over the valley, watched it paint the smoke and dust in shades of orange and gold, watched it illuminate the American guns on their distant hillside, and the fortress's broken walls, and the long shadows of afternoon stretching toward evening. Beautiful, he thought. It was all somehow still beautiful. "Do you think they're afraid?" Müller asked. He'd lit another cigarette, his last one. "The Americans, operating those guns, do you think they're terrified of what they're doing?" Heinrich considered the question. "I don't know," he said finally. "Maybe they are. Maybe that's the nature of this kind of power. It terrifies everyone equally, the ones who wield it and the ones who face it." "Or maybe," Müller said, exhaling smoke, "maybe they've moved beyond terror entirely. Maybe when you have weapons like that, you don't feel anything at all." The sun climbed higher. The shells kept falling. And deep beneath the mountain, in the darkness where men huddled and prayed and waited, Heinrich Brandt thought about apple trees and spring and promises that couldn't be kept, and wondered what Germany would look like when this was all over, if there would be anything left to recognize, if there would be anyone left to remember what they'd been fighting for, or if the terror they'd created and the terror now being visited upon them would erase everything, leave nothing but ruins and ghosts and questions that could never be answered. The fortress shook again, the mountain groaned, and Heinrich closed his eyes and tried to remember his sister's face, the sound of her laughter, the way the apple blossoms smelled in that long-ago April before the world caught fire.
He couldn't. The memory was gone, torn away by the sound of guns that could obliterate fortresses, that could make mountains tremble, that could make grown men realize how small they were, how fragile everything they'd built had always been. 3 months earlier, before the Americans brought their atomic cannons across the Rhine, before the fortress walls cracked and the world turned to dust and thunder, Heinrich Brandt had been something close to happy. It was December 1944, and Fortress Königstein still felt impregnable. The winter snows had settled over the Eifel Mountains in thick drifts, insulating them from the war's immediate chaos, creating an illusion of permanence that Heinrich found himself believing despite everything he'd seen in the previous 5 years. He woke each morning at 0530 hours in a small room he shared with 3 other corporals, dressed in the weak light of a single bulb, and felt something almost like peace. His routine was precise, comforting in its predictability. After morning roll call, he helped in the fortress's bakery, a cavernous room carved into the mountain's north face where industrial ovens produced 2,000 loaves daily. The work was hot and strenuous, kneading dough in massive wooden troughs, feeding the ovens with birch logs from the surrounding forest, but Heinrich had come to love it. There was something fundamentally optimistic about baking bread, about creating sustenance, about the smell of yeast and wheat and the promise that tomorrow men would need to eat, which meant tomorrow existed. The head baker was a man named Otto Fleischer, 68 years old, too old for combat but too essential to spare. He'd been a master baker in Munich before the war, had operated a shop on Marienplatz where tourists bought pretzels and wealthy customers ordered elaborate wedding cakes. Now he commanded 5 assistants in a fortress kitchen and treated each loaf with the same care he'd once reserved for cream torts. "Bread is honest," Otto told Heinrich one morning as they worked side by side, their hands white with flour, their faces flushed from the oven's heat. "You cannot lie with bread. You use good ingredients, proper technique, adequate time, you get good bread. You take shortcuts, you get garbage. It teaches you something about the world, yes?" Heinrich had smiled, had nodded, and thought about how Otto's philosophy was exactly opposite to everything else the war had taught him, that there were no rewards for honesty, that shortcuts and lies were the only way to survive, that all the proper technique in the world couldn't save you from a Russian shell or an American bomb. But he didn't say any of that. Instead, he kneaded dough and let Otto talk about Munich, about the shop on Marienplatz, about his daughter who'd married a violinist and moved to Vienna before the Anschluss. He listened to these stories the way other men listen to music or prayer, as something that affirmed the existence of a world beyond the war, a world where people made bread and fell in love and worried about ordinary things. His afternoons were spent maintaining the fortress's administrative records. This was work suited to his nature. Heinrich had always been precise, methodical, uncomfortable with the chaos of combat, but competent at organizing information. He sat in a small office with Private Werner Klein, a former school teacher from Dresden, and they cataloged everything: ammunition inventories, food supplies, fuel reserves, personnel rosters, equipment status reports. Werner had a wife and 2 daughters he hadn't seen in 18 months, and he kept their photographs pinned to the wall above his desk, a constant reminder of why accuracy mattered, why keeping track of everything was a form of resistance against the war's disorder. If we maintain proper records, then even if everything else fails, at least someone will know what happened here. At least there will be evidence that we existed, that we tried, Werner liked to say. Heinrich appreciated this idea more than he could articulate. He copied names into ledgers with careful penmanship, double-checked supply counts, filed reports in folders that might never be read but represented nonetheless a kind of immortality, a paper trail that would outlast them all. In the evenings, when the work was done, Heinrich walked the fortress's perimeter. This was his own invention, not required by duty but necessary for his sanity. He followed the walls in a circuit that took 90 minutes to complete, moving through corridors and across ramparts, descending stairways carved from living rock, and emerging onto observation platforms where the mountain fell away in vertiginous drops. The fortress had been built over 5 years, employing thousands of workers, and their labor showed in every perfect corner, every precisely fitted stone. During these walks, Heinrich encountered other soldiers engaged in their own evening rituals. Corporal Franz Weber,
who climbed to the highest tower every sunset to watch the light die across the valley, smoking cigarettes and singing quietly to himself, old folk songs his grandmother had taught him. Lieutenant Dieter Hartmann, who practiced his violin in an empty ammunition magazine, the Bach partitas echoing strangely through the concrete chambers. Private Hans Vogel, the butterfly collector who somehow maintained his specimens even here, pressing delicate wings between pages of salvaged books, creating a catalogue of fragile beauty in the heart of a war machine. These men became Heinrich's companions without ever quite becoming his friends. They existed together in a state of suspended intimacy, too close for formality, too aware of mortality's nearness for genuine affection. They shared cigarettes and chocolate rations and occasional conversations that started deep and ended nowhere, as if all of them understood that building real connections now would only create more ghosts when the inevitable losses came. But there was one exception. Sergeant Johannes Müller had taken an interest in Heinrich from his first day at the fortress. Heinrich never fully understood why. Perhaps because Heinrich reminded Müller of someone from his past, perhaps because Müller recognized a kindred spirit in Heinrich's quiet competence, or perhaps because the old sergeant was lonely and Heinrich seemed stable enough to bear the weight of another man's memories.
They fell into the habit of meeting in the fortress's chapel every Sunday evening. The chapel was a small room that had once been a storage chamber, converted by a priest who'd been killed in a bombing raid 6 months earlier. It contained 12 rough wooden benches, a simple altar, and a crucifix carved from oak by one of the soldiers. The space smelled of stone and candle wax, and possessed an acoustic quality that made whispers sound like prayers. Müller never actually prayed. He sat in the back pew, smoking, despite the prohibition, and talked. Heinrich listened. "I was 17 years old at Verdun," Müller said one evening in December, his voice low and reflective. "February 1916. Can you imagine? 17. I thought I was invincible. Thought the war was glorious. All that propaganda, honor, duty, defending the fatherland. I believed every word." He paused to light another cigarette from the dying ember of the previous one. "The French had this fort, Douaumont. Biggest fortress in the world, everyone said. Impregnable. Our generals said we'd take it in a week, that superior German engineering and courage would overwhelm any defense." Müller laughed, a sound like grinding glass. "You know how long the battle lasted? 10 months. 300,000 men died fighting over that one fort. 300,000. And in the end, nobody won. We just stopped, walked away, left the bodies rotting in the mud, and pretended it had meant something." Heinrich had heard stories of Verdun, of course. Every German soldier had. But hearing it from Müller, who'd been there, who'd survived it, made it real in a way that history books never could. "I learned something at Verdun, about fortresses, about what men build when they're afraid. You know what I learned? That there's no such thing as impregnable, that you can bury yourself as deep as you want, behind as much concrete and steel as you can pour, and death will still find a way in. Because the real fortress isn't made of stone, it's made of belief. And once that cracks, once men stop believing in the walls around them, it's over. The fortress becomes a tomb." He looked up at Heinrich then, his eyes infinitely tired in the candlelight. "That's what this place is going to become. You know that, don't you? Another Verdun. Another pointless monument to human stupidity. And we're going to die here, probably, defending something that doesn't matter because we can't imagine any alternative." Heinrich should have been disturbed by this nihilism. should have reported it perhaps to the officers who worried about morale and defeatism. But instead, he found it oddly comforting, as if Müller's honesty was itself a kind of fortress, a place where truth could be spoken and examined without judgment. "Why do you stay then?" Heinrich asked. "If you believe all that, why not leave? Desert? There must be ways." Müller smiled sadly. "Where would I go? I'm 53 years old. I have no family. My wife died of typhus in 37. No children. The house in Leipzig is probably rubble by now. I'm a soldier because that's all I know how to be. And maybe because someone has to remember. Someone has to survive long enough to tell the truth about all this. Maybe that's me." These conversations stayed with Heinrich long after they ended, coloring his perception of everything around him. He began to see the fortress differently, not as protection, but as a cage, not as strength, but a desperate attempt to deny reality. The thick walls that had once seemed reassuring now felt oppressive. The deep tunnels weren't shelter, but merely a postponement, a delay before the inevitable. Yet he continued his routines, because what else could he do? He baked bread with Otto, maintained records with Werner, took his evening walks, attended Sunday meetings with Müller. He existed in a state of productive dread, knowing the end was coming, but unable to do anything except continue the motions of life. In January 1945, the first refugees arrived. They came in small groups, fleeing the Soviet advance from the east. German civilians who'd lived their entire lives in Prussia or Silesia or Pomerania, and now found themselves ahead of a red tide that showed no mercy. The fortress wasn't designed to accommodate civilians, but Colonel Steiner couldn't turn them away. Where else could they go? So families camped in the outer courtyards, in equipment storage rooms, in any space that offered shelter from the killing cold. Heinrich helped organize the refugee camps, distributing blankets and food, trying to maintain some semblance of order. He met a woman named Kath Schmidt, who'd walked 200 miles from Königsberg with her 3 children, 2 daughters, ages 7 and 9, and a son who was 4. Her husband had been killed by Russian artillery. She had no other family, no destination except west, and the vague hope that somewhere, somehow, there would be safety. "Do you think there is?" she asked Heinrich one evening as he brought extra rations for her children. "Safety? Do you think if we just keep moving west, we'll find a place where the war hasn't reached?"
Heinrich looked at her children, hollow-eyed, silent, wrapped in blankets that were too thin for the temperature. The youngest, the 4-year-old boy, clutched a wooden toy soldier that was missing an arm. Heinrich thought about telling her the truth, about explaining that there was no safety anywhere, that the war had swallowed the entire continent and would probably devour them all before it was satisfied. Instead, he said, "Yes, I think if you keep moving west, you'll find safety. The Americans are different from the Russians. They take prisoners. They don't—" He stopped, unable to finish the sentence, unable to articulate the horrors everyone had heard about but nobody could fully process. Kate smiled at him, a broken thing that didn't reach her eyes. "You're lying," she said gently, "but thank you. It's kind that you would lie." She left 3 days later, heading further west with her children and 20 other refugees. Heinrich watched them go from the fortress walls, watched them disappear into the white landscape, and wondered if he'd ever know what happened to them. Probably not. Probably they would become statistics, names in lists nobody would read, another small tragedy swallowed by the war's larger catastrophe. February brought American bombers. They came in waves of 30 or 40 aircraft, high enough that anti-aircraft fire couldn't reach them effectively, dropping their payloads in patterns that suggested industrial efficiency rather than malice. The fortress itself was too hardened to fear conventional bombing, but the surrounding area, the supply roads, the villages, the small towns that fed the fortress with labor and resources, those were vulnerable. Heinrich watched one raid from an observation post, watched the bombs fall like seeds from some mechanical harvester, watched the earth erupt in neat rows of destruction. Somewhere in that carpet of explosions were homes, churches, farms, lives. Afterward, parties went out to recover any supplies from damaged convoys, and Heinrich volunteered, needing to see the results of what he'd witnessed. The village of Niederwald had taken 3 direct hits. What had been a hamlet of perhaps 40 buildings was now primarily craters and burning timber. The survivors, maybe 20 people, sat in shocked clusters, covered in dust and blood, staring at nothing. An old man wandered through the ruins calling for his granddaughter. A woman tried to dig through collapsed masonry with her bare hands, oblivious to the fact that her fingers were bleeding. Private Vogel, the butterfly collector, stood beside Heinrich, surveying the damage. "We did this," he said quietly. "Maybe not this exact village, but villages like it. In Poland, in Russia, in France. We dropped bombs on people's homes and told ourselves it was necessary, that it was war, that the other side deserved it or had done worse." He looked at Heinrich, his young face aged by comprehension. "And now it's our turn. And I can't even say it's unfair. How could I?" Heinrich had no answer. They spent 4 hours helping the survivors, pulling bodies from rubble, distributing what medical supplies they had, then returned to the fortress in silence. That night, Heinrich couldn't sleep. He lay in his bunk, listening to the breathing of his roommates, and thinking about circles, about cause and effect, about whether any of them had clean enough hands to complain about the violence now being visited upon them. In early March, the Americans reached the Rhine. News traveled through the fortress like a disease, whispered in corridors, passed in coded glances, manifested in the increasing tension visible in every man's shoulders. The great river barrier had fallen. The Western Front, which had held since the failure of the Ardennes offensive, was collapsing. And still the orders came from higher command. Hold, defend, die with honor. Colonel Steiner called an assembly in the main hall. The entire garrison gathered in a space designed for perhaps half their number. He stood on a raised platform, ramstrog straight, his uniform perfect, and delivered news that everyone already knew but needed to hear officially. "Gentlemen, the strategic situation has evolved. American forces have established bridgeheads across the Rhine at multiple points. Our defensive line is contracting. Our supply situation is challenging. However, Fortress Königstein remains vital to the defense of this sector. We will continue to execute our mission. We will hold this position and deny the enemy use of this ground and these resources. We will perform our duty." The words were correct, proper, exactly what a German officer should say in such circumstances. But Heinrich heard something else beneath them, a hollowness, a recognition that they were speaking lines in a play whose ending everyone had already read. After the assembly, Heinrich sought out Otto in the bakery. The old man was working alone, kneading dough with mechanical precision, his face creased with exhaustion. "The flour is running low," Otto said without preamble. "Another week, maybe 2, and we'll have to start cutting the bread with sawdust again. Remember the sawdust bread from last winter? Tasted like longer." He paused in his kneading, stared down at his flour-white hands. "Do you know what the worst part is? I still care. After everything, I still care about making good bread. I still want each loaf to be perfect. Isn't that absurd? The world is ending and I'm worried about the quality of bread." "No," Heinrich said. "It's the only thing that makes sense. Everything else is madness. Caring about bread, about doing one small thing well, that's the only sanity left." Otto looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You're a good boy, Heinrich. When this is over, if you survive, you should become a baker. You have the right temperament for it, patient, careful, willing to do small things with precision." He smiled sadly. "Though I suppose there won't be much call for bakers in the ruins. People will need builders first, soldiers second, bakers last." That night, Heinrich tried again to write to Greta. He sat at the small desk in his quarters, paper and pencil before him, and attempted to find words that could bridge the gap between his experience and her understanding. How could he explain what it felt like to watch a fortress slowly die? How could he describe the weight of knowing that everything around him was built on delusion, that all the strength and permanence was illusory, that concrete cracked and steel bent and mountains themselves could be brought low by men with sufficient will and weapons? He wrote, "Dear Greta, I think about the apple tree often. Do you remember Father's promise that it was proof spring always returns? I find myself wondering if that's true, if there are some winters so severe that nothing survives them, some darkness so complete that dawn never comes, or if faith in spring is itself enough, if believing creates the possibility." He stopped, crumpled the page, started again. "Dear Greta, I am well. The fortress is strong. We have adequate supplies. The men's spirits are good. I hope this letter finds you and Mother healthy. Please write when you can. Your loving brother, Heinrich." Lies. Comforting lies that would tell her nothing and spare her everything. He folded the letter, addressed it, placed it in the outgoing mail sack that might or might not ever reach a functioning postal system. Then he sat in the darkness of his quarters and tried not to think about what spring would bring, what fall would reveal when the winter finally ended. The third week of March arrived with the sound of distant thunder. At first, Heinrich thought it was a storm. The Eifel Mountains were prone to sudden weather, dramatic atmospheric displays that could turn noon to midnight in minutes. But this thunder was too regular, too rhythmic, too obviously artificial. The Americans were bringing up their heavy artillery, positioning it for the assault that everyone had known was inevitable. Sergeant Müller found Heinrich during evening mess. "Walk with me," he said, and together they climbed to the highest observation point, where the view stretched unobstructed across the valley. In the dying light, Heinrich could see the American positions being prepared, vehicles moving, equipment being emplaced, the coordination of an army that knew exactly what it was doing, that had broken harder fortresses than this, that possessed resources so vast that even this, a massive assault on a mountain stronghold, was merely one operation among dozens, a footnote in a campaign already won. "Tomorrow or the next day," Müller said. "That's when they'll start, with everything they have." He lit a cigarette, his face illuminated briefly by the match's flame. "I've been thinking about what I said to you about